Namaskar. The First Anglo-Afghan War from 1839 to 1942 AD. This is a salvage representation of the First Anglo-Afghan campaign 1839 to 1942 AD in fought to recast the narrative of the war so that it accounts for the variety of narrative actors in the war and in the geopolitical crisis leading up to it. The Great Game may have been a tournament of shadows between the British and the Russians, but it was entangled by both local dynastic conflicts and challenging even insurgent physical terrain as well. Though the British officially won the war, Afghan was hardly secure either during the occupation or in the decades that followed. In that sense, the First Anglo-Afghan War presaged a century of precarious imperial power on the front of the Raj. One of the most arresting British images of the First Anglo-Afghan War is Lady Elizabeth Butler's painting "Remnants of an Army", 1874. It shows William Brydon, an assistant surgeon in the East India Company, astride a bed-raised horse limping across an otherwise deserted plain. Brydon was one of the sole survivors of a force of 4,500 strong that was routed from Kabul after the city's 3-year occupation by the British, though the British eventually returned to retake the city and burn the bazaar. That rout was an inglorious endpoint in a war that was to entangle the Raj in the region for the next 8 decades, having been promised safe passage out of the city by the tribal leaders of an anti-occupation insurrection. Rebel leaders to whom guns and treasure had been handed over. British military personnel and some 12,000 camps followers were ambushed and massacred on their way to Jalalabad in January 1842. Norris 378 and sorry, another major defeat for the British Army took place at Gandak and on 13 January 1842 when officers and soldiers of the 44th Foot were effectively decimated by Afghan tribesmen. These hot tribesmen, using the advantages of local knowledge about the terrain here as they had throughout the war, roundly defeated whom what remained of that portion of the army of the Indus charged with the defense of Kabul. Though this may sound like a projection forward of 21st century narrative, it is not only uncannily historically accurate, it captures the line, lineaments and tone of victory, commentary, and representation of the First Anglo-Afghan War as well, despite the legend that Lady Butler's painting helped to promote Biden. Bryden was Bryden was not the sole British survivor of the Kabul rout. Several dozen others were captured, among them Lady Florencia Sale, wife of Major General Sir Robert Sale, who commanded the garrison at Jalalabad. Ladies Sel, for her part, survived her 9 months captivity, wrote an account of her experience as a journal of the disasters in Afghanistan from 1842 to 41 to 1841 to 1842 and was widely admired for her acts of bravery during her imprisonment. But despite individual acts of heroism, the retreat from Kabul and the subsequent massacre came to be symbols not just of a single military disaster but also of a precarious imperial strategy that endangered that subject of inter-regional conflict and far-reaching geopolitical crisis known as the Great Game, attributed to Arthur Connolly, an East India Company captain and intelligence officer. The term refers to the contest between Britain and Russia over which imperial hegemon would dominate Central Asia in the 19th century. In fact, British and Russian designs in the late 1830s were part of a multi-sided struggle between would be global powers on the one hand and narrative force on the other, including the once formidable Sikh Empire and a complex of regional tribesmen seeking dominion, if not sovereignty. In this graveyard of empires, the British feared Russia's invasion along the northwest frontier, which was viewed by both parties as the gateway to India, but they were also wary of the peasants who in 1834 had their eye on Herat, one of a number of strongholds they had lost in the wake of the collapse of the Safavid dynasty in the second half of the 18th century and had been striving to recover ever since Ivan. In that sense, the Great Game involved more than two players. In fact, it had many dimensions, only some of which depended on the mutual suspicions of two European powers, though later historians have famously viewed the war as a tournament of shadows between the two Western powers with local judge proxies Victorians representing the war exhibited more respect, albeit often grudging, for the power, impact, and historical significance of regional dynastic regimes, even as they often relished seeing them caught in the crosshairs of a wider global imperial struggle for hegemony. The key to British stability on this frontier was thought to be the Emir of Afghanistan, Dost Muhammad, scion of the Barak, Barakzai tribe, and a man at the very intersection of several imperial gambles. Though he was courted by the British and sought alliance with the Russians, it was the empire of the Sikhs and more particularly its seasoned leader Ranjit Singh, who was his long-standing nemesis since seeing the first Sikh Maharaja was at the end of his life when these tensions flared, but he was a formidable warrior almost until the last. A series of strokes beset him in 1837, for which he was unable to recover. Singh had been engaged in conflict with the Afghans for the better part of 20 years, and especially with the Barakzais, whom he defeated in 1834. His forces fought Dost Muhammad again in 1837, and that victory allowed him to retake Peshawar, thereby consolidating the Sikh Raj and capping his career as the so-called Lion of the Punjab. So while the British shot in Dost Muhammad a bulwark against Russian imperial ambition, the Great Game was arguably a sideshow to local imperial dynastic contexts in which he and his family had been entrenched for decades. Though he had pledged fealty to the British, his relationship with the Russians was a cause for concern. Once he was perceived as a double crosser, his reputation in British imperial history as a duplicitous, duplicitous, duplicitous warlord was sealed and only negligibly revised by the fact that he was again an ally after the end of the war. This is not to say that the British did not try to play him against Singh or against the Russians. They were attuned to the regional stretch of their diplomatic mission and divided on the prospect of an alliance with the Dost Muhammad. Lord Auckland, the Governor-General, was less well disposed towards him than his political agent on the ground, Sir Alexander Burnes. Neither of them was capable of fully appreciating the fact that their quest to bind those Muhammad fully to them was not to be, for his main concern was company support against the Sikhs in the recapture of Peshawar, which the British were unprepared to offer. Schofield, Auckland's Simla Manifesto of 1838, which stated that the British needed a reliable ally on the northwestern frontier in order to secure India, was not exactly a declaration of war, though it was a pretext for intervention. Failing Dost Muhammad's operation in March of 1839, Sir Will By Cotton advanced through the Bolan Pass, installed Sastujai, the new empire, and occupied Kabul. Dost Muhammad obtained a fatwa and declared jihad, but the local historians of Barakzai tradition meant that his natural base in the southern Afghanistan was loath to support him. He fled, later gave himself up after attempting a failed insurrection and ended up in exile in India. Logan and McMichael Sasuja had long been tethered to the British, not as ally so much as its supplicant. He had been overthrown by a rival in 1809 and had been living in exile in India ever since. The singular advantage he had over those Muhammad was that he was an ally of both the British and the Sikhs, with whom he had actually brokered a treaty in 1833. The British determined, in other words, that embracing an enemy of the Sikhs was worse for the security of India than supporting their nominal ally. Though the march to Kabul was by no means easy, though the countryside was not subdued until well into 1841, if ever, and though local tribesmen and peasants continued to attack supplies and convoys on a regular basis. The fortress of Ghazi fell relatively quick in summer of 1839, and though today's historians may assess that particular burst as a self-evident, eyewitness accounts testify to stop and start character of the struggle on the ground and the lack of finality, if not of victory, that characterized the whole campaign for Afghanistan in this period. Meanwhile, the occupation of Kabul, undertaken to stabilize Sujat's early reign, dragged on for 3 years, looking increasingly permanent to a variety of observers of Khan resistance, prime among them in a part of valiant officers and soldiers. Military officials encouraged families to join the occupying army in the city. Life under the occupation was routinized and pleasant, at least for some. Lady Sel had an elaborate kitchen garden attached to her house where she grew sweet peas, geraniums, potatoes, cauliflowers, radishes, turnips, artichokes, and lettuce. Though she professed the Kabul variety of the latter, hairy and inferior to those cultivated by us, she found the Kabul cabbage superior, being milder, and remarked on how well the red cabbage grown from English seed did even in the bracing climate of Afghanistan. Still, others were more restless. Afghans were particularly discomfited by traffic in native women that moved in and out of the cantonments. As one historian has noted, the proverb necessity is the mother of invention and father of the Eurasians is manifest. Schofield, the cost of maintaining such a large military and civilian contingent was a drain on the Indian treasury. The danger to supplies and to the occupiers of themselves at all ranks was considerable and in some cases fatal. Warren was assassinated in the context of an uprising direct, at least in part, against the occupation forces. He was hacked to death by a mob despite trying to reason with them. It is said in his best Persian Scofield, the report spread the Afghans were bombarding the cantonment, and it was clear that the security of Kabul was in peril. Sir William McNaughton, advisor of Auckland, was forced to negotiate with the new Afghan leader Akbar Khan, son of Dost Muhammad. The terms were humiliating total withdrawal, self-passage and return of those Muhammad, but McNaughton was confident that they would be met. Instead, Akbar Khan ambushed him and his three assistants. McNaughton's body was dragged through the streets of Kabul and his head paraded as Akbar's prize, symbols of British defeat and humiliation, and a harbinger of what's to come. The retreat and the massacre that followed were among the bloodiest episodes in British imperial history. One witness estimated that 30,000 men and women alone died on 7th January 1842. As they could look back and see the glow of the fire that now consumed the cantonment. Norris, Sir William Elphinstone, and several other officers were taken prisoner by Akbar Khan, which added to the demoralization and sheer despondency to any resistance that British troops were inclined to put up, either as a fighting force or Women collectivity was significantly hampered by the notorious mountain gorges and by the bitter cold and snow, which survivors described in vivid terms as red with the blood of men, women, and children, not to mention camels and horses as well. The destruction of the retreating army, that what the late 19th century historian Archibald Forbes called the shock of the catastrophe in the passage in the passage galvanized Auckland, who authorized Field Marshal Sir George Pollock to organize an army for a retribution, even though this had not been part of the original plan. Forbes Clements Kabul was taken by the fall of 1842 and its bazaar destroyed by British forces in retaliation. The British hostages were released via negotiation that granted their guardian Shah Muhammad a pension for life. Akur Khan was finally defeated, though his father, whose political activities had not been diminished by exile, quickly established his authority in Afghanistan, where he continued to reshape the fortunes of Central Asia, no more still in alliance with the British until his death in 1863. Despite his relative powerlessness during the early years of his reign, Dost Muhammad shaped Victorian Afghanistan as much as, if not more than, the British Noele. He may be seen as a part of a long line of patrimonial state builders, a prime example of the empire of tribes at the heart of the Afghan state formation and one of the region's three giant players in the Victorian period. Misdal Kakkar, as significant for the region's history was the death of Ranjit Singh in 1839, which left his kingdom vulnerable and drew his successors into several wars with the East India Company in the later 1840s. The annexation of Punjab was the result, following so closely on the heels of the debacle in Afghanistan. These post-war events demonstrate how inextricably linked the empires of tribes were with each other. The with the fate of the Great Game, and of course with the conflagration yet to come. The mutiny of 1857 significantly Dost Muhammad kept his alliance with the British in that fight, even though his aid to the rebels might have tipped the balance. If these imperial histories are tightly woven, their interstitial inter, interstitial connections have not come to the fore in historiography of the First Anglo-Afghan War, at least not in any sustained way. Indeed, only very recently had Western scholars tried to reconcile of this region, punctuated by multiple spheres of influence and ambition, as having its own autonomous history of frontier power mentality. However fragmented it was, ironically, late 20th and early 21st century wars in the region have made such histories all the more necessary, even as they have spawned an outpouring of great gamish accounts from the 19th century onward. Then historians have more ironically than not linked the first war with the second, 1878 to 1818, and have wrestled chiefly with the question of blame for the former. Archibald Forbes, in his 1896 account of both the first and second wars, take issue with Sir John Kay's view that the British had done all they could in the face of those Muhammad's betrayal by installing Shah Shuja as then he then goes after Auckland, as have numerous historians before, and since many of whom open their narrative with reference to that common Victorian sobriquet for war, Auckland's falling Forbes. Afzal Iqbal, writing under the imprimatur of the Research Society of Pakistan in the 1970s, concurred with these indictments and even sought to rehabilitate the ill-fated Barnes in the process. Punjab scholars have Punjabi scholars have had a lot to say about the role of Mohan Lal, who was engaged by Burns as a commercial agent because of the Persian language skill he had acquired in Delhi. Lal's writing remained a major source for how events unfolded, especially during the insurrection at Kabul in 1841. He was also at least indirectly involved in the assassination of Mir G. Then Afghan chief who was a sworn enemy of the British Gupta. The role of the Sepoys, Indian soldiers who fought in the British army from the Persian Sipahi, had also been extensively noted by both witnesses and historians of the campaign. Their bravery and their martial skills come across vividly in a variety of accounts and in some of the paintings of the war as well. James Atkinson, superintending surgeons to the army of the Indus, not only wrote of his experiences but produced images of them as well, including a watercolor view of sepoys attacking Baluchi snipers in the Siri Kajur Pass 1839, though they may not have had as intimate a knowledge of the local terrain as the Khyber Ridge Baluchi sniping at them. By all accounts, the Sepoys were more adept at maneuvering in the rough terrain than the average British soldier. The visual and textual images of the monstrous gorges and formidable mountain defiles are most commonly referred in the context of the terrible flight from Kabul, but in fact memoirs of the war are filled with descriptions of both the harsh landscape and its lush fruits and captivating vistas as well. Officers like Henry Havelock and James Atkinson, both of whom chronicled the war only up to 1840, were repeatedly taken by sights like the picturesque ravine fringed with high reeds and groves of the jujube and the neem tree, or the sweet silver line of river that might erupt in the most unexpected places. Havelock Atkinson, at times their narratives read like naturalists' accounts, if not environmental histories as well. In that sense, those who chronicled the first Afghan war fell in behind a long tradition of ethnographic writing about the region from Elphinstone 1815 to volume an account of the Kingdom of Kabul onward. The British viewed knowledge about local flora and fauna as military intelligence, despite the fact that it appeared to them little good in the actual field, and because the war itself was only intermittently battle centric, and the British were perpetually pressing against the possibility of sudden skirmishes and sniping. These were the kinds of guerrilla tactics that would keep them on the defensive along the northwest frontier at least until the end of the century, when Winston Churchill wrote about the Malakand, Malakand field forces as a war correspondent and recorded minutes. Similarly, failed and pitiful British military responses to by now well-practiced anti-colonial tribal warfare significantly, while narratives of the First Anglo-Afghan War have their share of Orientalist tropes, repeating Afghans and tribesmen as savage, deceitful, and terrifying opponents. Such rhetoric was arguably more common in and around the Second War, 1878 to 1880, as was the British occupation with jihad and fanaticism. Nonetheless, Victorian representations from and about the 1839 to 1840 to war conveyed a sense of the ongoing challenges to imperial security and stability that Afghans and Afghanistan routinely posed both in and outside of the battle per se. Though Afghanistan was technically held by the British until the Third Afghan War in 1919, through which an independent Afghan nation was created, British hegemony there remained precarious and vulnerable across the whole of the 19th century. The First Anglo-Afghan War has had a long life in the British imperial imagination, even as the Second Anglo-Afghan War was breaking out. Historians were busy producing histories of its predecessor and predicting future failures. In his 1982 novel To Herat and Kabul, G.A. Henty prefaced his fictional account of the first Afghan war campaign with the observation that in the military history of this country there is no darker page than the destruction of a considerable British force in the terri- terrible defiles between Kabul and Jalala, Jalalabad in January 1942. In the pages that follows, he gives one of the most concise and jingoistic accounts of the main events of the war, dramatizing them for a generation of readers who were hungry for imperial fiction, especially for of the voyage adventure kind of which he was so well known. Fiction writers have been fascinated for decades by the spectacular failure of this first campaign. Treatments include Maud Rivers' 1913 Judgment of the Sword, which focuses on the Herat and George MacDonald's Fraser's best-selling 1969 Flashman novel, the first of a series. The latter has been the most popular vehicle for bringing the first Anglophone war to 20th century readers. Larger-than-life Harry Paget Flashman is the protagonist at Gandakmak Gandakmak, Jalalabad and Kabul, imprinting generations of imperial adventure fans with images of British daring do. Meanwhile, Patrick NSA 2009, the Junior Officers Reading Club, subtitled Killing Time and Fighting Wars, and dedicated to memorializing his own Afghan tour. Among others, is the most recent echo of the bravado and nervy self-confidence of Englishmen growing up in today's messy and small world as the backover blurb enthusiastically and all too blithely proclaims how 21st century writers will take up the first Afghan war as they seek to make connections and connect the connections with the contemporary events remains an open question, though the chain of narratives has already begun. The real challenge for historians seeking to write anti-imperial histories will be to break free of the dicto, no, dichotomous great game story and rematerialize Afghans and other natives as agents side, right, agents right-sizing their role in shaping the character of the war and its outcomes. What's needed, in other words, is a truly post-colonial history of the first Anglophone war, one which tries to recapture the sets of that narrative that was everywhere to be found in the Victorian representations of it. It should be care to seek them. Bibliography: Atkinson James, The Expedition into Afghanistan. Notes and sketches descriptive of the country contained in a personal narrative during the campaign of 1839 and 1840. London, William Allen, 1842. Print. Being Richard. The Great Game of Afghanistan, London. Veron Books, 2010. Print. Churchill, Winston, The Story of the Malakand Field Force, 1898. London. Leo Cooper, 1989. Print. Clements Frank, A Conflict in Afghanistan, A Historical Encyclopedia. Santa Barbara, ABC Clio, 2003. Print. Durand, Sir Henry Marion, The First Afghan War and Its Causes, London. Longsman Green, 1879. Print. Elphinstone Mount Stuart, An Account of the Kingdom of Kabul and its dependencies in Persia, Tartary and India, London. Longsman Hurst, Ridge, Orme and Brown, 1815. Evans Martin, Conflict in Afghanistan, Studies in Asymmetric Warfare, New York, Routledge, 2005. Print. Forbes, Archibald Stone, Wars, 1839 to 1882 and 1870 to 1880, London. Seal and Co., 1896. Print. Fraser, George MacDonald, Flashman from the Flashman Papers, 1839 to 1842, New York World Publishers, 1969. Print. Norris J. The First Afghan War, 1838 to 1942, Cambridge, UP, 1967. Print. Roy Kaushik, Introduction, Armies, Warfare and Society in Colonial India, War and Society in Colonial India, Oxford, UK, 2006. Print. Schofield, Victoria, Afghan Frontier, Feuding and Fighting, Central Asia, London. Tourist, 2003. Print. Say Lady Florencia, Journal of the Disasters in Afghanistan, 1841 to 42, 1843, Lahore, Sang-e-Meal Provisions, 1985, print, Singh Khushwant, Ranjit Singh, Maharaja of the Punjab, 1780 to 1839, London, George Allen Unwin, 1962, print. Mustaq Nabi, Afghanistan, political frailty and foreign interference, London, July 2006, print. Nehru Jawaharlal Introduction, Punjab Central Asia and the First Afghan War by Hari Ram Gupta, Chandigarh, Punjab University, 1940, print. Niwale Christian State and Tribe in early Afghanistan, the reign of Amir Dost Muhammad, 1962 to 1863, Surreal UK, Karjan, 1997, print. Namaskar. Sorry. Hopkins, Benjamin D. and Magnus Marsden, Fragments of the Afghan Frontier, New York, Columbia, UB 2006, print. Iqbal of Circumstances leading to the First Afghan War, Punjab, Lahore, Research Society of Pakistan, 1975, print. Kakkar M. Hassan, A Political and Diplomatic History of Afghanistan, 1863 to 1901, Boston, Brill, 2006, print. Leuven, Earle and Josetti Michael, Images of Images of Afghanistan, Exploring Afghan Culture Through Art and Literature, Oxford UB 10, print. धन्यवाद, thank you so much.